That's a little more time in part of that.
Yeah. Is this the first line?
Yeah, I'm just launching.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, well, we're gonna get started, then if we need to pause, that is okay. So, good morning, it is January 24th, Friday, and Senate Natural Resources and Energy. And we are joined today with the chair of PUC, Ed McNamara, and I feel like we should probably do some introductions to get us started here. And so, yeah, Senator Hardy, would you start us on?
Sure. Hi, Ed, I'm Ruth Hardy. I'm the senator from Addison District.
Terry Williams, Senator from Rutland District.
In Watson, Washington District, and Gene Newman, Minnesota.
Bongo, Bennington, Senator District. Scott back, Caledonia.
Thanks, and Ed McNamara, chair of the UC.
Do you need a minute?
Oh, yeah, I'm good. I'm doing it over there.
I have to maybe done some sleep.
Oh, okay.
All right.
Oh, is that TV working now?
All right.
Yeah.
Last like you said.
I know. Uh-oh. You should just learn to not ask.
No, you see it, leave it.
Great. Thanks, that's. All right, so I'm gonna move through this fairly quickly. Just so folks are aware, I put together this presentation for House Energy. And there I had an hour and 15 minutes, here's half an hour, so I'm just gonna, like, completely get everyone's way too busy. I'm just gonna fly through some of these slides. My contact information is at the end. If anybody has questions on anything that I flew through, please just let me know. So just general context, every state has some version of PUC. We've been around in multiple forms since 1855. We started as Railroad Commission, early 1900s, late 1800s, started regulating the electric sector. And it's somewhat similar for pretty much every single state. They started off regulating the railroads, grain silos, out in the Midwest, different things like that. And the underlying concept of why we actually exist is monopoly utilities have great unfair access. There's no competition to sort of constrain prices. And so regulators step in and we effectively take the place of competition to ensure that those captive customers are not unduly harmed. So starting probably in the 1980s, across the country, PUCs moved from sort of very nerdy economic folks to start taking on more policy issues. We started looking at environmental externalities and power supply issues. We started looking at, okay, what are the environmental costs of just relying on coal or oil? And how does that factor in with respect to renewables? Obviously that eventually moved us to renewable energy standards, net metering and all that. That's the evolution that's happened over the last 7 years. The main difference between Vermont and most other states, we have a much bigger role in setting electric generation than any other state. Talking to a counterpart in Massachusetts, they only get involved in solar generation siting if it's 100 megawatts. Our largest solar project we have one so far is 20 megawatts, so completely different scale. In those other states, it's the local level we're setting for small scale generation takes place. And a large portion of our work does involve setting. So who we actually are, there's 3 commissioners, we're staggered 6-year terms. Subject to review by judicial nominating committee, appointed by the governor, confirmed by the Senate. We also have clerk, and her office is responsible for actually primary interaction with the public in managing the cases. We have a couple hundred cases at any given time, so the three commissioners don't hear all of those. We have hearing officers and 8 attorneys right now, 7 analysts. Those folks hear the case, run the case, manage the case, and then present a proposed decision to us. Parties have the opportunity to comment on that proposed decision. We make the final decision. And I'll just say it right here, if somebody doesn't like the decision that we come up with, they can appeal directly to the Supreme Court. And so it's fairly quick resolution. We also have a director of operations and business manager. Not on the slide, we have something called EPUC, it's a case management system. But it's also an opportunity where it's a way that any member of the public can access any document that's filed with the auditor. So it's very easy to actually find those.
You said judicial nominating?
For the 3 commissioners, yes. We are, for the chair, I'm appointed the same way as the Superior Court judge. It's the exact same process by statute.
Okay.
The other 2 commissioners are very similar.
Is that, I think of you all as sort of quasi judicial. Is that?
Yeah.
A fair assessment?
But I have that on my next.
Oh, sorry, okay.
No, it's fine, but I'll just do it.
Hearing the question and behind the question.
Yeah, so we, quasi judicial, and effectively what, the way I think about it is we're a regulatory agency, but we have the powers of a court. And so we act in a court as basically as a court. We need at least 2 commissioners to make a decision, which is why whenever I'm here and opining, it doesn't mean this is the commission. It means chair of the commission. So our cases can be split into 3 different categories. There's contested cases. Those are just like a court. You have sworn testimony, you have ex parte prohibition. We can't talk to parties. We actually can't talk to anybody about that case. So if you call me in and say, I'm really unhappy about this particular case, so that's great. You can file a public comment. I'm not talking to you about it. We also have more open cases that are investigations where we take a look at, should we revise this policy? And that tends to not be a contested case, and that is much more open. And then we have rulemakings. We have broad rulemaking authority to promulgate rules. Those are not contested cases either, but we try to keep them within in the EPUC context, the case management context. We keep it in a pace if we're starting a case so that people can easily find the information. So those are 3 primary functions that we have. And I'd say the majority of what we do is through the contested case process. So much more judge or judicial. Funding, we're primarily funded by gross receipts tax paid by the company and regulated by the PUC. Get some money from application fees, a little bit from bill back as well. Electric load, natural gas, pretty much every utility, their revenues fluctuate, and especially electric and natural gas. They fluctuate based on weather. And so nice mild summer or a nice mild winter, revenues are actually going to go down because they're not selling as much electricity or natural gas. So our budget, effectively gets impacted a little bit. We do have a little bit of a reserve. I know that's unusual in the state government, but we kind of need that to keep with the fluctuations. So just to be really clear, we're not Department of Public Service. We're quasi judicial, we're independent of the administrative or the administration. I talked about adjudicative versus legislative, just different way of saying sort of the contested case, judicial versus rulemakings, which are more legislative in nature. And Vermonters participate in all proceedings that we have. So there's always an opportunity for a public hearing. Department of Public Service, executive branch agency, by statute, they appear before the commission in every single case that we have. They represent the public interest. For the state, they do long-term planning, and they work directly with consumers on complaints that we don't even see. They also interact directly with the Department of Energy as well. So especially, this isn't, I'm picking electric because I'm an electric nerd, like, I've been doing electric regulation for 20+ years, I know it really well. Most of my examples are in this sphere, and that is a good portion of the work that I do. Just for context, we don't exist in a vacuum. We have federal government in all spheres that we regulate. Electric is actually fairly well defined compared to some of the other ones. So on the state level, we regulate retail rates. So in other words, your Green Mountain Power is my utility. So your Green Mountain Power bill, your DEC bill, whatever bill, we regulate the prices that GMP is charging the customer. We're also responsible for distribution planning, mentioned siting. Generation portfolio just means renewable energy standard. It's actually something that you folks do when we ensure compliance with. On the federal side, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, they're responsible for wholesale rates. So in other words, how much does GMP pay for generation? How much do they pay for transmission? All those are actually regulated at the federal level because it's interstate commerce. Federal level is also responsible for transmission planning. I think you heard from ISO New England. They administer the transmission planning components, but FERC regulates them. And also the feds regulate all prices paid to generation with some exceptions. I'll go through those quickly. Just skip over the first part. The two circumstances where we can actually, we the PUC can set prices directly net metering, because theoretically it isn't actually generation, it's a reduction of your load. And then Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act from 1978-79. During the oil crisis, Congress implemented a law that essentially encouraged to some degree renewables and cogeneration, but mostly opening up sort of access to monopolies transmission lines. And so if a merchant generator, a generation not owned by the utility, wants to come in and provide power, that's great. Even better if they're using a fuel that is not natural gas or oil or coal.
Yes, that's a good question.
Mhm.
Okay, this might be a silly question, I don't even know. But I did get a question from a constituent
Yeah.
about the prices of the energy that's generated from Hydro-Quebec that comes into Vermont. How is that price regulated?
Yeah. So in most circumstances with large generation like that, it is the utility that works directly. In this case, all the utilities collectively worked with Hydro-Quebec to set the price that the utility was willing to pay Hydro-Quebec. We're not involved in that aspect. We come in afterwards and say, given the facts available at the time you entered into the contract, was that price reasonable or not?
Okay.
We can disallow a portion of the costs associated with that price. And I think back in the might have been the 80s or 90s before me, apparently the PUC did look at that specifically with Hydro-Quebec and said, you paid too much, or the terms weren't before me, so I'm not sure the particulars, but my understanding is there was a significant case, and it was the PUC saying to the utilities, we don't think you did a good job with the contracts. We typically don't do that. Disallowance of cost is it's essentially the regulator who doesn't operate an electric system, doesn't negotiate contracts, going out and telling somebody you did this wrong. There typically has to be something particularly egregious for that to happen.
Okay. And so will the price that the utilities are paying to Hydro-Quebec is set in a long-term contract through contract negotiations. And so at this point, the second part of my constituent's question was whether or not the potential proposed tariffs would have any impact on that price, but it sounds like no, because that's already been negotiated. Or is it maybe?
Yeah, honestly, I don't know enough about sort of international
Okay.
law and tariffs.
Neither do I, so I thought. All right, thank you.
I do know that in general, once a contract is in place, it takes a lot for the government to come in after the fact and manipulate that. I just don't know how it works internationally.
Okay, that's
I
fair.
had this conversation with Dylan Zwicky.
Oh, really? Okay.
Afterwards.
Excellent,
Yeah.
thank you.
Oh, so sorry, the end thing about this qualifying facilities, Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act. Standard offer program is essentially one of our implementations of PURPA, and therefore we're allowed to set prices. The commission is allowed to set prices for standard offer. It's also been a heavily litigated program since it was created. And these, I'm just gonna fly through very quickly. We regulate electric. I've already talked most of this. The only new thing in here, provision of energy efficiency services. We have Efficiency Vermont's statewide provider efficiency, except for City of Burlington, which has its own municipal electric department. They do their own efficiency programs. One other aspect as well, the utilities are actually by statute on the hook to deliver energy efficiency. Efficiency Vermont is doing it for them to meet their statutory obligations. So it's an interesting sort of statutory concept. Let's see. Natural gas, in some ways very similar to electric in terms of our regulation of tariffs. I'll talk about integrated resource planning later. Also siting, very similar to electric. Telecommunication is where we start sort of splitting. We have very limited regulation of telecommunications, and by that I'm talking about consolidated short-term telephone, like the old-fashioned telephone, like pick it up, it's got a cord in your house. We have some authority over service quality, and most where we interact most is actually citing the cell towers. But we don't really regulate the wireless providers. We don't particularly regulate broadband or internet service providers. And that largely reflects that at the federal level, the idea is to have competition. And so this federal statute limits what the states can do, in some cases explicitly. And to the extent folks are interested in telecommunications, I'm happy to have somebody who knows it really well come in. We have some authority over cable television. We set the franchises. They really haven't changed much. Regulate some degrees service quality, but we have nothing to do with what channels are offered, the rates. So people occasionally call us and say, I want this.
With football, I think it is on private, and we can get it.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Water systems used to be a bigger deal. I think it came up recently with respect to Woodstock. We only regulate private water companies. We don't regulate municipal water companies and fire districts, which are essentially co-ops. And even the ones that we do, we only regulate their rates. We don't really talk about quality of water. That's ANR. They have significant jurisdiction over water systems. Yes.
Can you define private water companies? I mean, there's if somebody's pumping out of the aquifer, truck it to Poland Springs or one of those companies, is that?
Yeah, that's actually not us because that's not being, that water isn't being sent to end use customers on the pipe. And so a private water company, the way that I've seen it at least, is a developer builds, 30 houses or something that's too far from the municipal system. So the developer puts in their own well and pipes and is otherwise not regulated except by us. So, but if that water system joins the municipal, then we no longer regulate them because they're municipal. Just want to talk about general principles really quickly. And these are sort of core values when we're regulating. Least cost planning, just be clear what this means. So first, ensure safety and reliability. I will say that in the last several years, the definition of reliability or what reliable means, especially with major storms happening. That's been an ongoing discussion. It used to be, we have reliability metrics, those are good. Now we have storms, wiping out entire systems. So that's a little bit in the state of flux at the moment, but when you think about least cost planning, you think, what's safe, what's reliable, and then meet the need for energy service at the lowest cost. Lowest cost is not just economic, includes environmental costs as well. So it really is a balancing of the lowest rate that we can provide to customers, as while also maintaining the appropriate environmental standards as well. And these days, especially with renewable energy standard, you folks are sort of setting that, what is the expectation around in what's required for environmental, what is considered a good level of environmental impact associated with the electric sector. Let's put it that way. And we don't, also with least cost planning, we don't say whatever the cheapest resource is, go all in on that. Because you want balance in a portfolio. You actually want a good portfolio approach, just as you would with a retirement fund or anything else. So you look at energy efficiency, load management, generation, and you try to balance all those different factors. I mentioned earlier, monopoly utilities have captive customers. Theoretically, somebody can go off grid. It's difficult, it's work. So effectively, most people are captive customers for their electric utility. So one of the principles that's evolved over 100+ years is that the rates paid by these captive customers should reflect the cost to serve those customers. And that's societal benefits. They can be included in those rates as long as it's tied to that sector. So the cost of complying with renewable energy standard, that makes sense for it to be included in electric rates. A couple of years ago, there was discussion about a farm methane project. Farm methane projects have this great benefit of they reduce phosphorus. So there's one farm methane project in particular, and this is when I was back at the Department of Public Service several years back. There was discussion about should Green Mountain Power pay a higher price to the farm methane project compared to other generation because of the phosphorus reduction benefits. And at the time, I argued no, because that is a societal benefit outside the electric sector. And if the legislature wants clean water, figure out another way of paying for it. Don't use electric rates to pay for it. The other side note is it's very easy to put things in electric rates, because if you ever had the misfortune of doing a rate case of any kind, things are constantly moving. It's very difficult to actually say this is driving this cost. You can sometimes do that at a broad level, but if you start putting societal costs in, it's very difficult to track this. So there's no opaqueness that is difficult as well.
I just want to do a quick time check.
I got one more general principle after this, and that's the main thing, so one sketch. So the other thing too is that utilities have to have the opportunity. You can't tell a utility do something and you pay the costs and not charge for repairs. If utility has to do something, they're allowed to recover reasonable costs associated with that. Last general principle, cost causer pays, and this is essentially if you're investing in new infrastructure, and I'll just make a point between several years back, there was a ski area that was significantly expanding and had to upgrade their entire substation. It was about a $1.5 million infrastructure improvement. That ski area ended up paying a certain portion towards the upgrade, not 100%. And the reason that they didn't pay 100% is that if you increase infrastructure and that allows more sales of electricity, it means more revenues for the electric utility, which actually pushes down rates for everybody else. So when we talk about increasing the grid for upgrading the grid for electric vehicles. There's one of the things that we've just started looking at is, are all the utilities ensuring that when they look at the upgrade costs, are they assigning it to the person responsible for that upgrade? If it's a collection of folks who all put in EVs, there's a good argument that the increased electric sales, the revenues from those EVs is actually going to more than make up for the cost of the infrastructure. So it gets into a thorny issue. The other aspect with cost hazard pays is that because we look at the revenues that come from this, from the generation side, generators always pay the upgrade costs because they're not adding new revenue to the system.
Feel like there's more in there that I want to talk about, and we don't have time, so.
This is a big thing,
Yeah.
it's gonna be an interesting discussion.
Yeah.
So I had a couple other slides talking about PUC proceeding types, I've already mostly covered those, so I'll just last 2 minutes for questions.
Any questions? Yes, go ahead.
It sounds like we don't have time to get it,
Oh,
but
no.
this last conversation that you just started, can you repeat it? Cause you
Yeah.
piqued my interest, but then I didn't quite understand the point you were trying to make.
Yeah, so sorry about that. So the main point here is that, and this actually gets back to prices should reflect costs, so captive customers. And you need to make sure that individual customers. I'm just gonna use an example for an electric vehicle. Depending on the location of that customer with the electric vehicle, it might be that they need to upgrade their lines associated with it. And I'm not talking about the panel on their house, I'm talking about the Green Mountain Power's lines. If it's one customer, the cost of upgrading that line is likely greater than the revenues that are going to come from that electric vehicle. If there are 20 customers all in that area and you're upgrading that line, the revenues are going to exceed the costs. And so then it just becomes this interesting question of how do you analyze this in a way that reflects there are benefits to all ratepayers when you increase the sale of electricity, when you increase electric vehicles, but you need the infrastructure to be able to achieve that. And sorry, I feel like I'm still not necessarily landing, but it really becomes an analysis about does the increased kilowatt hour sales to make up for the infrastructure costs? And right now, it's not 100% clear that all utilities are taking the exact same approach, and it's something that we're looking at the moment. So you might hear more about it.
So in this, are these specific cases that are coming before the PUC, or are they just, is this a sort of policy discussion that's what the PUC is having?
It's a policy discussion that's happening because these are not individual cases that are coming to us. The utilities tend to do a lot of the stuff. They can't come to us with every single action. So they do most of the work on their own and then sort of come to us every year, 2 years, however many years for a rate case.
Correct.
That's when we dig into things. And the way that process works makes it interesting because you're diving really deep on Vermont Electric Co-op. And then 6 months later, you're looking at Green Mountain Power and you're not necessarily the same steps. You're trying to figure out all these policies. Are the ways that they're reflecting costs consistent across all the utilities. And electric vehicles is the issue that I think has come up most recently for us. There's actually a report, I don't know if you folks got it, transportation did receive it though from us on electric vehicle rates generally. And there is a little piece about allocation of infrastructure upgrade costs.
So when you're making those calculations, for the example of the EVs, do you all take into consideration like social cost of carbon? Just trying to think of like what are the societal benefits?
It's a great question, and I don't think we're at that level of detail yet.
Yeah, okay. Right, I was trying to think about like how do we thinking about the people, particularly in rural settings where you might not have a cluster of 20.
Yep.
And that the limited size of that transmission, box or whatever, is preventing someone from getting an EV, for example, you know, like that's a real. I feel like that's worth thinking about and, you know, trying to figure out.
Completely agree. The other piece to just to complicate is some of the distribution lines and transmission lines can last for 100 years. Like I worked on a case for the transmission line, well, this is about 100 years. And so once you put that upfront investment in, it's got a really long life. And so it makes sense to actually make sure you're right sizing is the term used in the industry right now, right sizing that infrastructure, which is in some ways gets work. So sorry I went over.
No, you're fine, thank you. Any other questions?
No, that's really interesting.
It is really interesting,
Yes.
there's
So
so much.
again, my contact information at the back, please let me know if you have any questions, I'll respond, and anything else that you want me to present on, let me know. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Can you come back and do the 257-page report line by line?
Yeah, by the way, thank you for doing
Yeah, of
that
course.
presentation last.
Have a good weekend.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks.
Gosh. Time is still here in this building. Okay, super, thank you. All right, and so we're gonna gear shift to put the Vermont Clean Water Act, and we have Michael Green, Legislative Council, to can you tell us about this?
Yeah, no problem.
Do you need a minute?
I been having problems with tonight. I've had a morning. Delia, I think, fixed it, but I need to. Really,
You're in the right room, we understand that.
You have a lot of sympathy.
you sent me the Zoom, and now I don't see it.
I'll send it again.
We had to upgrade the summer to advance the cattle and
Oh, yeah.
be ready.
Oh, I know, I got.
Yeah, no, it's a real thing for particularly a lot of rural Vermont.
Good,
Oh, yeah.
So I heard the utilities were charging people $10,000 to upgrade their line. If it wasn't beneficial to them.
Yeah. Yeah,
but I think they have to, they can pay, if anybody else hooks onto that,
Yes,
They can-
that is true.
they can get over and recoup some of that cost.
interesting. I
Rural,
feel like there's some,
They,
Rural.
the customer or, okay.
huh,
they want to bear
Not
the cost.
sure.
Yes.
I feel like there's something there
Yeah.
that's worth digging into.
Yeah. Good point.
Yeah,
I just went through,
did you upgrading?
well,
Come on.
some,
Oh,
I
really?
gave him some land to build a house,
Oh, that's exciting.
at the, up here, building power.
Mhm. Yeah,
Was something. Almost a line. Yes.
Okay, so I've been doing a overview of water. That's really starts with the Federal Clean Water Act. And I can do that, or I can go right to kind of the this Vermont Clean Water Act. What would you like?
I think it would be helpful to have, even briefly, just what is the federal context that sets the stage for the state context? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, well, so I'm just gonna start with this PowerPoint then. This is Michael Grady, the State Council. So in 1972, Congress passed the Clean Water Act and it amended an existing law, but that existing law had allowed for things like rivers to catch fire. So there needed to be some significant response. how water and water pollution is handled in the US. And the Clean Water Act is multi-purpose. It's not just about getting a permit. It also has requirements for water quality, like standards and how to meet those standards. Wetlands funding provides a lot of funding, and there are other components of it as well. And they are all supposed to meet the goal of restoring and maintaining the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's water. That's the goal of the Federal Clean Water Act. And the Federal Clean Water Act does it in many ways, but primarily through two major functions. It's the permitting requirement and the water quality requirement. So the permitting requirement generally requires a discharge of pollutants to navigable water to obtain a permit, or else it is prohibited. Well, those terms, discharge, pollutant, navigable water, are all kind of loaded terms. So a pollutant is anything. It is literally anything you add to the water, including heat. So if you draw water in to cool something in your facility, and when you discharge it out again, it's hotter than when you drew it in, that is a pollutant. So pretty much anything you do or add to the water is a pollutant. And then a discharge, or where it is from, is the addition of that pollutant to the navigable water from any point source. Well, the point source I'm going to get to in a minute because it relates to the current debate about agriculture. Navigable water is also a term that has received a lot of debate. So the EPA tried to define what a navigable water is, and they define that by saying it's the water of the United States, including the territorial seas. Well, that's not particularly clarified. So they had to go to a rule to define what is a water. And so it's navigable water, which is things where you can transport or use a boat on. It's the tributaries of those navigable waters. It's interstate waters, those waters that cross state boundaries. And it's wetlands. And it's those wetlands that are connected to surface waters. And it used to be wetlands that had a significant effect on those traditional navigable waters. So it wasn't surface connected, but it might have been connected underground or somehow was significantly affecting that surface water by providing chemical, physical, or biological integrity of that water. Well, people didn't like that. They thought it was too broad, that it extended too far from that traditional navigable water, and there was litigation challenging that definition. And the court found in the US Supreme Court case of Sackett versus EPA that the Federal Clean Water Act only gives jurisdiction to those wetlands with a continuous surface connection to bodies that are waters of the United States in their own right. So the wetland has to have a surface connection with that navigable water, the tributary of the navigable water, that interstate water. Otherwise, it is not regulated by the Federal Clean Water Act. But that doesn't mean.
Wait, that case was just in 2023?
Yes.
But when was the Clean Water Act was passed, like in the 70s, right?
1972.
So it was not litigated, that particular point about
The definition has what scope that the Clean Water Act has over wetlands have been litigated for years. For instance, in 1997 or 8, there was this case called SWANK versus EPA. SWANK was an acronym for Solid Waste Agency of Northern Cook County of Illinois. And they challenged what was called the migratory bird rule. And EPA was saying that they had jurisdiction over isolated wetlands because migratory birds flew from state to state to those wetlands and therefore provided interstate jurisdiction to EPA, even though they were isolated from those traditional navigable waters, and the court was like, oh, come on. It's like, you can't extend it just because something might. You know, it has to be a consistent connection, and so from when we went from. The EPA had jurisdiction pretty much over everything, because migratory birds
Go everywhere.
they're everywhere. So now it's just those surface connection wetlands. And there are several cases in between.
Okay.
In here.
Okay,
But that doesn't mean that Vermont is gonna be significantly affected, because wetlands are no longer at the federal level jurisdictional, because they're significantly affecting waters. And that's because Vermont, like every other state, can adopt higher standards than the federal clean water. They can go above and beyond what the feds require, and that is what Vermont has done for pretty much every one of its water quality programs. The discharge program, which you can look at here, remember we were talking about how the Federal Clean Water Act is a dischargeable pollutant to a navigable water. In Vermont, it's a discharge of any waste, which is again, pretty much anything, to any water. And water is all rivers, streams, creeks, brooks, reservoirs, ponds, lakes, streams, and all bodies of surface water, artificial or natural. And it has, over the past couple of years, been clarified to include wetlands. And in Vermont, jurisdictional wetlands, you don't have to have a significant connection to a surface water. You just need to be determined to be significant. And a significant wetland is one that has functions and values that make it significant. And there's a whole process that the Agency of Natural Resources uses for that. So that federal decision, that SACIT decision about surface water connection, it really did not affect Vermont, but it highlighted how Vermont can go above and beyond the Clean Water Act. And that has happened in state stormwater operating permits, significant wetlands, stream alteration, Lake Champlain, Lake shoreline permitting, and state large farm and medium farm permitting.
So here's the question.
Class two wetlands, are they automatically significant?
They have to be determined to be significant. So there has to be an evaluation, either by the agency or a wetland scientist, that the agency will accept that evaluation.
Class one automatically significant?
No, well, class one is the highest, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you have to be a class two before you're class one, and so it's already significant, but then by rule. There's it has to be designated class one, which has a much more restrictive uses of a class one level. And so, and when something is going to be designated a class one wetland, it usually brings out opponents because they are scared of how it's going to affect.
I was
Surrounding.
Oh, yeah, sorry, so the first class one wetland. Yeah. But okay, but it's interesting, so it's parallel though, even though your class one is still be deemed significant for this purpose, that was my.
For regular, the purpose of regulation, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
But all right, so Vermont has its own permitting authority. But the Federal Clean Water Act permits are specific to certain types of discharge. And one of those is for concentrated animal feeding operations. Remember, I was going to talk to you about what a point source is. So I can just talk about it. So a point source under the Federal Clean Water Act is a ditch, it's a pipe, it's a conveyance, it's something discrete which flow the pollutant can run through into the water. But it has this little funky end of it. It's a ditch, a pipe, a conveyance, or a concentrated animal feeding operation. So a farm, which is a concentrated feed animal feed, is the same as a pipe. Except for what's called agricultural stormwater discharge. So anything that runs off of a production facility of the farm, the area that's where your animals are held and fed for more 45 days or more in any year, and there's no vegetation, anything that comes off of that into the water, that's a discharge. But when you're out in the field and you're applying your nutrients or your manure or your fertilizer and it rains and that stuff runs off into the water, that's not a discharge if you had applied it according to site-specific conditions. And site-specific conditions have been interpreted and required to be a nutrient management. So if you're out there with the nutrient management plan and you're applying your manure according to it and it rains and the manure runs into the water, that's not a discharge.
But if it runs into the water and goes through
If
the pipe,
it goes
yes,
from the production facility, the manure runs, somehow gets out of the cow barn and rifles down into the water, that is a discharge.
right, but even on the field spreading example, if it goes from the field down into a ditch.
Not
isn't
if,
it?
not if it
No.
has been applied according to the nutrient management. Now, if you don't apply it according to the nutrient management, the example I use is there was a custom applicator, somebody you hire to apply your manure, your nutrients. He was applying it from Franklin County. His equipment broke, the honey wagon fell over, the load discharged onto the land, ran across the land he was applying it to, ran across the neighboring land into the water, into Lake Champlain. Well, that was a discharge because it wasn't applied according to the nutrient management plan of site-specific conditions. But EPA Clean Water Act also requires permits for industrial wastewater, municipal wastewater, stormwater, and when they want to, basically, which is called a residual designation authority, when they determine that the discharge contributes to a violation of water quality standards. So EPA has delegated all of those permits to Vermont. In 1974, they did that, and they had done that with 47. Although some people say 48, I think it's still 47. 47 of the states. And some of those states are very close by. New Hampshire and Massachusetts are not delegated states. EPA still has to issue the permits in those states for those federal NIPTES permits. But not in Vermont. Vermont has been issuing these NIPTES permits since 74. So that's where permitting is. There's those federal permits that EPA requires and that Vermont A&R has been issuing, but Vermont has gone above and beyond some of those standards because they have the authority to do so. But now we're moving into the water quality aspect.
just a quick question. Is the reason that Vermont was delegated the authority to issue permits from the EPA is the reason because we have gone above and beyond? Or is there another reason?
No, in 1974, we were not above and beyond. In 1974, the discharge permit requirement was page long. And it was pretty easy to keep.
Okay, so why did we get it, but Massachusetts didn't?
They didn't apply for it.
Oh, it's just because we asked.
We asked for it.
Got it, okay.
So there's a component of the Clean Water Act that relates to water quality. Remember, going back to the purpose of the Clean Water Act, restoring and maintaining the quality of the water is the purpose of the Clean Water Act. So the first thing that the Clean Water Act requires is that states have to establish water quality standards. They have to say what it means in that state for the water to be clean with regard to the different types of pollutants and the different types of things that can affect that water. And those standards have to meet and fulfill the designated uses of the water. And the state gets to designate what its uses are, and many of them are very intuitive: drinking water, recreation, fishing. Some of them are not. Aesthetics, aquatic biota, aquatic habitat, and you can even go beyond these listed uses. In some states, mining is a use. In some states, hydro is a use. So you are not limited in what you designated as a use, but these are generally what are considered the designated uses, and they are the designated uses. And so one of the things for water quality that the Clean Water Act requires is A&R has to go out every 2 years and assess the waters to see what they are, how they're doing. And generally, they're doing okay. When you look at the river miles, like A&R says that about 5,800 or 5,800 miles that were assessed, and about 4,400 fully support all designated uses. That's 75%. You might think that's just a C, but when you look at the other states around the country and you grade on a curve, we're probably further towards the top of the grade scale than other states. But that doesn't mean that we escape the other requirements of the Federal Clean Water Act. And this is the water quality assessment, the last one from them. You can just find it if you look at it, it's just right there. So there's another requirement that the state has to go out every 3 years and look at those waters that it's assessed to determine if any of them don't meet the water quality standards and why they don't meet the water quality standards. And if they don't meet the water quality standards, they are impaired. And when a water is impaired, they have to come up with a cleanup plan, and the cleanup plan is called the TMDL. So stop there. When you first do a TMDL, the state has to come up with the TMDL. If EPA disapproves that TMDL at a later date, EPA then has to issue the TMDL. And the Clean Water Act says they have to do it in 90 days, just farcical, but that's what it says, right? And so just remember that for context. So there is a list of impaired waters in the state, and this list is the list of waters that are impaired and don't have a TMDL. There's a list of waters that are impaired that have a TMDL. There's a list of waters that have are aquatic nuisance issues, and there's a list of waters that are stressed because they are on the edge of going to impairment or going into an aquatic nuisance issue. So there's several lists, but this one is usually what people refer to, 303B list. And you should be aware, you're from all across the state, all of you, and all across the state there are impaired waters. They are in every basin of the state. It affects all of you, it affects all of your districts. So what are the causes of impairments? It depends. It depends on the uses of that water. It depends on, might depend on history. It might depend on whether or not there was a mine in the area. It might depend on whether or not there was industry in the area that used PCBs. It all depends. And so generally, when you look at some of the major causes in Vermont, sediment, turbidity, and flow, the rain is a big impairment because it scours the riverbanks and adds sediment to the water, and sediment can add phosphorus to the water. It can also just impair the aquatic biota or aquatic habitat. So when you hear about some of the impairments, the stormwater impaired waters were the big issue in like the mid 2000s. And that they were impaired for flow because it rained and the rivers were not really capable of accepting that in a way that supported the designated use. Since that time, the impairments that you've been hearing about for Champlain and that for Magog, they're being impaired because they no longer support the designated uses of aquatic habitat, aquatic biota, and recreation in certain segments of those lakes. And that is because of phosphorus. And the phosphorus comes from multiple sources: stormwater on developed lands, agricultural land, even runoff from forest land. Pristine forest land has phosphorus. So those are generally the sources, but again, it depends. You could go out to one segment and it'll be impaired because of PCBs. You can go out to another segment, it's impaired because of chloride. Go out to another segment and it's impaired because of heat, you know, so it all depends.
One question, so does the state get more credit for more testing? I mean, is it? A lot of people in my district have been receiving letters from DEC asking them to voluntarily test their wells. And I'm curious why that is. Not everybody's getting it, some people.
So that's for wells. And you're from Rutland, right? And you're from a more rural area of Rutland. Right, so they're concerned about PFAS.
Correct.
And so because there's no well testing requirement. There is no well testing requirement. They're looking for volunteers to test to see what the extent of PFAS is in groundwater. Okay. So what is a TMDL? A TMDL is a goal. It's like your budget, you know, your overall household budget. It's what you want to spend in the month, or for TMDL, it's what you want to allow, what maximum amount of pollutant you want to allow in that water that still supports all of those designated uses. So right now, Lake Champlain, there's too much load of phosphorus going in, so you're not meeting your budget, and those uses are designated. You need to reduce that load, and you have to get it back to your budgeted amount. And you do that by, there's a formula. And the high level formula is you take the load from point sources and the load from non-point sources like agricultural runoff. And you then build in a margin of safety, because when you're using non-point sources, you're basically dependent on the rain. And like nobody can predict the rain. And so you have to build in a margin of safety. So you take the maximum amount of phosphorus from point sources, the maximum amount of phosphorus from non-point sources, and then you add a margin of safety, and that is what your target is in order to get that water back to a place where it can meet all of the designated uses and is no longer impaired. So how do you get there? Like, remember, a budget is a budget. It's just your target. You know, I have kids and like, they blow my budget up pretty much every month, right? Like, oh, I need this new book for school and it costs $300. I'm like, what? You know, so what do? The way you get there is called an implementation plan. Vermont has implementation plans for Champlain and for Magog. But how we got to these implementation plans is very curious. Remember, I told you when there's an impairment, the state has to come up with the TMDL. But if EPA disapproves that TMDL, EPA has to come up with the TMDL. And their implementation plan is reliant on what they have permitting authority. They don't have a lot of enforcement authority in the Clean Water Act except for their permits. All right, so how do you get to that budget when you only have 5 different permits that you can enforce to reduce the load? Well, you're gonna have to require every wastewater treatment plant in the state to like go to 0, which is like millions and millions of dollars. You're gonna have to require every farm in the state, pretty much, not just the livestock farms, you're gonna have to have every farms do water quality measures. You're gonna have what's called the residual designation authority, where they're gonna go around and they're just gonna pick places and permit those places. And that's what you were looking at with EPA's authority for the Lake Champlain TMDL. You were looking at them trying to meet that budget with tools that weren't successful or very, very costly and not cost effective. So Vermont, very much appreciating that EPA can't do anything in 90 days, came to the table and said, hey, we have better ways of reaching the load. We'll use our authority to adopt permitting that's above and beyond yours, like we already do. And we will implement those and we will get to that load in a more cost-effective way. And so that's what they did. And how they got there was Act 64. The things that they offered to EPA to do to get to the load without EPA imposing very expensive, not very cost-effective measures, is Act 64. Now I'm going to jump off of this and go to Act 64. So on your website, there's a very detailed Act summary. Our Act summaries are supposed to be like a page or a half page at most. This is like 3 pages long. So I provided a bulleted summary instead to tell you basically what Act 64 did. First, and this is what they call the Vermont Clean Water Act. You didn't call it the Vermont Clean Water Act. You called it what it was supposed to be called, an act relating to the water quality of the state of Vermont. A&R said, oh, that was too long. They wanted something clean and fun. And so they called it the Vermont Clean Water. So it addressed kind of some of the major components, the sources of the impairment in Lake Champlain, agricultural water quality. It required all farms to meet the required agricultural practices, to require those agricultural practices to be amended, to implement multiple new requirements. It required small farms to certify that they comply with the RAPs. It required training for all farms. It required custom operators to be trained and certified. And it directed Agency of Ag and A&R to develop an MOU on how to apply enforcement, including the anti-degradation policy. So that was significant, and the Agency of Ag went through a rulemaking process on the RAPs that was difficult. The farming community was unhappy about what they would be required to do and how it would change their practices and the cost of their compliance, but they did it. The RAPs were amended, requirements have been implemented, lots of practices have been implemented, lots of money has been spent. And there have been successful returns. And we'll get back to that in a minute. But another thing that the Act 64 did is it addressed stormwater permitting in the state. And it required, and let me just step back. Pretty much every single one of these was controversial, but it's been controversial over time. So the first one that was controversial was the requirement that municipalities implement what's called the Municipal Roads General Permit, where they had to implement all kinds of stormwater measures in order to control sediment coming off of roads. And you will see it. But the one that I remember most is I was going over Lincoln Gap And I was coming from like the Waterbury, Waitsfield area over it in. And the whole road down into Middlebury was lined with rock. All the way down, and that was the municipal roads general permit. And municipalities did not like that, and you probably heard about that. But they did it, they implemented it, they got some money from the state and they did it. So that was the first one. The second one was
So I was just saying, sure.
was moving in the construction general permit, and the construction general permit is, if you're going to disturb land of an acre or more, and that's the feds, acre or more, then you need to implement stormwater control measures on that land. Well, Vermont went to a half acre. Well, that brought in a lot more activity into the general permit, and people didn't like that, but people did. Then the next one, the one you're hearing about, is the 3-acre general permit. And that was a requirement that the impervious surface of 3 acres or more that had never been permitted for stormwater or had been permitted prior to 2002 needed to basically come up to the current modern standards, including retrofitting if necessary. And that is where you are right now, and the schedule for that.
Is this just coming into,
No, so in the Lake Champlain and Magog basins, they were supposed to implement that permit program by October 1, 2023, and they've interpreted implementing to mean that those people that are subject to it are notified and given a time period to apply. And so that has happened.
okay,
And I will, full disclosure, I used to live in one of those neighborhoods. They don't anymore, but they did. They sent out a notice to every homeowner in the neighborhood saying you might need to get an individual permit because you don't have a homeowners association. And B, there's too many attorneys in your neighborhood to create a homeowners association. And so that's a different problem, but you're gonna hear about,
There's another question here too. I don't know if you are done with your.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but, so along with the 3-acre impervious surface list, some municipalities were, they have impaired waterways going through them and had a requirement for flow reduction. But there was no time limit for them. So, because some of these properties that are on the list are downstream, they're affected by the municipality because they didn't do their plan.
I mean, that. Yes. And so. Remember, I was talking about the stormwater impaired waters, that those waters that were just being impaired because of rain and the flow and scouring them. We couldn't figure out, the state couldn't figure out how to get those waters into a TMDL because those waters are all different and they're all across the state. They're from Franklin County to Rutland County. A lot of them are in Chittenden County. So the conditions are different for all of those waters. So you couldn't really come up with one TMDL for all of them. And coming up with a TMDL for each of them was gonna be like, let's just say there probably would have been a lot of litigation. So what the state did is they required all of those municipalities, many of which were already an MS4 community. An MS4 community means under the Federal Clean Water Act, you have to implement certain stormwater controls in your municipality because your municipality is of a size and population that indicates that there's things that can be done to control the stormwater. but not all of the municipalities that had impaired stormwaters were actually federally MS4 communities, so. ANR used what's called its residual destination authority to declare Rutland Town and St. Albans Town as MS4 communities. And when they did that, they moved the stormwater impairment into the MS4 permit. And that's how they control the flow. You're like the municipalities, and they do have time to control the flow, to do projects within that water to reduce the flow so that the water is no longer impaired from. But as you said, water flows downstream, right? So if they haven't met the flow requirements upstream of flow, it's still flowing. And it's flowing at a higher rate than you want it to, and it's going through these communities. And there's still permitting uses around those waters. And I know that because remember how I used to live in one. South Burlington permitted development around my community. And guess where all the stormwater from the new development went? Into my subdivision. But they're not required to meet the 3 acre because they were permitted after 2002. Right, but it's going in to the old subdivision that doesn't meet the standards. Like, I don't like that. And I let the people know that
So I'm looking at it from a local level, been a board of selectmen, aldermen, and then the regional planning commission. These are all the problems that we grapple with. You said it, that, ANR and Department of Ag came up with standards that farmers didn't like, but a lot of them didn't. Well, a lot of them didn't, and they ended up closing their doors because they couldn't afford to do it. So and that's my viewpoint. I don't want to be difficult.
Right, but I think my point is similar to your point, is that there's still issues out there, and some of the issues are compounded by the need to do other things elsewhere, and sometimes those things aren't done elsewhere. And so, yeah, it's a full suite of activity, which you knew of in Act 64, because the theme in Act 64 was all in. Everybody's in. Everybody's going to take some responsibility for cleaning up the water of the state. Everybody's in. And now you're kind of seeing what all in means for some. And maybe all in isn't that great of a theme. If you're in southeastern Vermont, do you really need to do the 3 acre permit? Because your water is impaired, but it's impaired for nitrogen. Nitrogen doesn't run off an impervious surface. And like, do you have to do that? Or is that a good use of money? Could the state target that money for 3 acre to other places in the state? Yeah, maybe.
But we hear from the constituents who are saying that, that we have to, and the state's done a good job of coming up with some funding for permitting and coming up with a plan, but some of them didn't bother taking advantage.
Yes, and that you can lead a horse to water, right?
Right.
And
But
so
is it clean water? Or
it was expensive water. And so
permanent water?
yeah, they were out there, they were offering money to do kind of the engineering analysis, and even in some cases for schools and other places to actually do it. And some people just didn't apply. And some towns are taking a very different approach to it. Some towns are like, yes, let's be proactive, let's go get that money, we'll work with the residential subdivision to help you go get that money. And other towns are like, that's state problem, we've got our own problem. we don't have the capacity to like help you navigate this state permit. And so it's not just the state that's creating some inequity, it's municipalities making decisions about what they can do and the resources that they have to do it.
Thank you.
All right, so that's Act 64's big kind of outstanding issue, I would say, and I think we need to now move on to the other water outstanding
Just to give us a way, you know, some do it, some don't do it. What, can you give us an example of what it is?
Sure, so
Some sense of what it
so
entails.
when I was living in the subdivision that was subject to the 3-acre, South Burlington employees came out, knocked on every door in the subdivision, said, listen, we will work with you, we will be a co-applicant with you, we will do the engineering analysis, we'll get the money from A&R and we'll manage that. And then we'll let you know what you have to do and how you could form an association or other ways that you could pay off what needs to be done. And they've done it.
I was asking also about what needs to be done part, what does that actually entail?
You've got to meet the manual. And that means you have to put in control measures. They're moving away from ponds, but they're what you can do in your subdivision to meet the manual.
So grass, swales.
Whatever you can do, the engineers go in and do what's called an engineering feasibility analysis, what they can do in that space that they have to meet the manual. They never actually fully meet the manual, rarely they fully meet the manual, and then they have to pay some money off to offset the rest of that. But that's the first thing, like, what can we do? Some places you can't do anything. You can't do it.
To prevent runoff.
Right. You're like,
Runoff from leaving the site.
right, you might be in a neighborhood that's right up against a commercial development and right next to the interstate, and there might even be impaired water running through your neighborhood already. Where do you put anything to control the stormwater? You know, you would have to buy land from the commercial development to do it, and that's cost prohibitive for small middle class neighborhoods to do.
And are the commercial development and the highway, do they have requirements for their
Yes.
runoff?
It's not. There's no distinction in 3-acre between commercial and residential or religious or educational, or it's about what amount of impervious surface you have and whether it was permitted. And then for highways, for the state highways, they have what's called the TS4. They have their own permit that they are supposed to implement to meet clean water requirements. Municipalities have the municipal road permit,
Right,
what they're supposed to do. And then if you're in an MS4, you have additional requirements that you have to implement in order to meet the standards.
and how is the 3 acres measured? I mean, is it a specific development that all developed at the same time? Or could there be a 3 acre that is partly highway, partly residential, partly commercial?
It's about basically that unit development, and it doesn't have to have been all developed at the same time. It's how it currently exists in the permitting world. But they will look at the unit development for it in that town.
Okay,
And so, you know, in South Burlington, they have the Ledge Knoll unit, and that's one unit. And then they have the Butler Farms unit, and they have the Stonehenge unit. So they have created units in which they will assess amount,
And they use AMO,
A&R.
okay,
But it can include roads,
okay,
even if the road is municipally owned and maintained. He said it may not have been permitted. Appropriately when unit development.
yeah, I mean, my impression is that a lot of these are ones that. The units are 3 acres that were developed by a private developer. And the roads may be non-municipal roads, or they're private roads.
It can be both.
It can be both,
But you were right, it's usually what happened is that a private developer came in, applied for the unit development, maybe even got a stormwater permit. But never transferred it correctly to all the parcels in that unit. So, and then because that happened, maybe the developer died, maybe the permit expired and the developer never re-upped the permit, and there was a period in the 90s where A&R wasn't reissuing permits,
okay,
any. And so that created a kind of storm. You can use the modifier that you want to use.
Just another question here.
So that was a 3 acre. Somebody told me now there's a 1 acre. Any construction, new construction?
There's been the 1 acre since 2004.
Okay.
The 1 acre is what's called the state stormwater operational permit. When you are going to build 1 acre or more, or expand 1 acre or more, you have to get that stormwater permit. And it's how the state has met some of the stormwater, prevented some of the stormwater impairments. It's how we get a lot of load reduction under the TMDLs. But it's a for new permitting. It didn't reach back to the old stuff. That's what the 3 acre did. And when and it's really not a reach back. Some people are like, oh, this is retroactive and you're impairing my sovereignty. And I'm like, well, no, you never got a permit for it. And because you never got a permit for it, the state has 10th Amendment authority to impose public health requirements and safety requirements.
What if they got a permit from the municipality? And they had the subdivision had a tech. It was state approved that came in and looked at it.
Yeah, I still think the state has the ability to say you. Cause remember the and you might not like this, but. The 10th Amendment allows evolution of regulation. You can regulate incrementally. You don't need to regulate everything at once. When you first do it, you can regulate incrementally. And that can create some tension, but it's something that the US Supreme Court said is allowed.
So I know that everybody knows now in my community that you want a permit to build something, you gotta go to the municipality and get a permit. It's that if the municipality doesn't give you the permit, how do homeowners know that they have to go to the state?
Well, if you're a developer, and I mean including like maybe just a contractor that does one home here, one home there. They know about A&R stormwater permit, they know how to manipulate those permits so they don't go over an acre of impervious surface. They know what they need to do if they do go over an acre of impervious surface. So developers are very aware of the stormwater operating permit. Okay, so we got the EPA TMDL. We got funding for all of the Clean Water Initiative. It's called the Clean Water Fund. I think some of you may have actually been on the financing committees when some of this was done. You put a property transfer tax surcharge into the Clean Water Fund. You put the unclean beverage container deposits into it with 6% of the meals and rooms tax into it, and that basically generates about $50 to $60 million a year, 45 to $60 million a year. And this is the 2026 budget. What happens with that money is the Clean Water Board recommends how it should be spent to the governor. The governor then includes that recommendation in the governor's budget recommendation. She'll hear on Tuesday, I think. And then you decide how that money is spent through the appropriation process. It is not $46 million goes into the Clean Water Fund and then A&R issues grants from the fund. So it is basically on a lag. It's on that fiscal year lag. The money comes in, board appropriate it, and then it goes out in the next fiscal year. So there is an annual report about how that money is spent and how successful the program and the money spent has been.
Gave us that report.
Pardon?
We just heard about this annual report.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so I won't go into that. Julie probably came and told you about it. But let's now talk about the other major issue that you will be looking at, and it's enforcement of water quality requirements for farms. Currently, there is bifurcated authority. If you have a discharge from your concentrated animal feeding operation, A&R is supposed to permit that with a federal NIPD's permit. But in Vermont, when the PAFO rule came out in 2003, there were some very, very crafty individuals named Mike Green and Phil Benedict that read the preamble to that rule, and they read this part of the preamble that says EPA encourages states to maximize use of voluntary and other non-NIPD's programs to support efforts by medium and small farms to implement appropriate measures and correct problems that might otherwise cause them to be defined or designated as this CAFO. And then they go on and say an example of this are states are encouraged to work with state agriculture agencies and other stakeholders to create proactive programs to fix the problems of small and medium operations in advance of confounding the facilities to apply for NIPD's permits. And what that meant is you created the ag water quality program at the Agency of Ag, and you said none of the farms can discharge. No discharges. If you don't have a discharge, you don't need a NIPD's permit. A&R doesn't have authority to permit non-discharges. A&R has the authority to permit discharges. And so the devil in that was the design and like how it was done in a way to get farmers to actually do it, because this is one of my main frustrations out of being here for 20 years. So the accepted agricultural practices were adopted in the 80s. And you went to the mandatory accepted agricultural practices in the early 2000s. And then you went to the required agricultural practices in 2015. And you got these requirements for over 10 years. And I still hear people say farmers don't know that they're required to implement the required agricultural practices. Are you kidding?
Of course it is a problem.
Right? And that just frustrates me.
Yeah, I can share a little bit about that. It's like I dealt a lot with NRCS, the federal Department of Ag, and they would give you money to do things for like composting facility for manure piles. I took advantage of that. And then I found out afterwards it didn't meet state requirement. So, the first thing that people do is they apply MAG, of course, and then they start blaming people. But they didn't realize that if they, just because they dealt with the federal NRCS, that now they got to deal with the state NRCS. So.
Yes, I mean, there are a lot of programs out there where that dual jurisdiction can be confusing. wetlands is a clear program where there has been confusion in the past. But this is like 40 years now, right? That this program has been in place, and they're still saying that they didn't know about it. So that leads to something under the Federal Clean Water Act, where it's called citizen suit authority, where the Federal Clean Water Act gives individuals the ability to sue each other when one thinks the other is violating the Clean Water Act. Now, that doesn't actually happen that often, because in order to file that citizen suit of you against, say, Senator Bonner, I have to tell A&R first that I'm doing it, that I'm going to do it, and I have to give A&R, I can't remember, 60 days notice that I'm going to do it. And in those 60 days, if A&R initiates diligent enforcement, then I can't bring my citizen suit. So you don't see those that often, because EPA or the states jump in and like, they don't want it to go to because if there's litigation, they get pulled in and like, oh, the staff have to go to court. No, the staff have to go to court. We have to get our attorneys to like brief the staff or no ways. So they'll just do the diligent enforcement instead. But there's a second component of that Clean Water Act citizen suit. It's like someone can sue EPA for not doing what EPA is mandatorily required to do. And some of the things that EPA is required to do is A, ensure that TMDLs meet the TMDL requirements. B, ensure that states that are delegated meet the delegated requirements. And so in 2022, CLF, prior to bringing the citizen suit, one of the things that's it's a brilliant strategy. It's kind of like, hey, EPA, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. Why don't you do what you're supposed to do? And if you don't, then we'll sue you. So it's like a kick. And then if they don't do it, then you kick them again. So the 2022 CLF petitioned EPA and said, hey, Vermont's CAFO program is not meeting the NIPT's delegated requirements. A&R is not enforcing, A&R is not issuing permits, A&R is not inspecting. What are you going to do about it? We want you to issue corrective action or withdraw the NIPT's program from the state. And withdrawal of NIPT's is not just withdrawal of the CAFO program, it's withdrawal of everything. It's withdrawal of stormwater, it's withdrawal of CAFOs, it's withdrawal of industrial discharge, it's withdrawal of construction general permit. So when you withdraw, then EPA has to go issue all those permits. There are thousands of permits annually. So EPA would have to issue them if there's a withdrawal. So EPA looked at that petition in their timely way 2 years later, said, we agree with CLF. We agree that the agency of ag is not appropriately implementing its CAFO NIPT's permit program. It said why there's 7 things that they say that A&R needs to inspect, A&R needs to issue the permits, A&R needs to look at the nutrient management plans, A&R needs to enforce, A&R needs to enforce. And they said, give us A&R what your corrective action plan is going to be. A&R sent that corrective action plan on December 9th. They basically addressed each of the 7 things in their corrective action plan. EPA responded to that last Friday. I don't have it in my PowerPoint, but EPA said, this is a good start, but we need a lot more information. And so they gave A&R, people are saying 60 days, but I think they gave A&R to like March 18th to come back with more detail. What EPA said they needed, what A&R said that they will do, but A&R will probably say they will do more of, is going to require policy decisions by you. And that might mean just tweaks or it might mean wholesale changes depending on what policy you want to do. I think A&R's proposed corrective actions probably won't be significant legislation. It will largely be tweaks, changing definitions, clarifying A&R's permitting authority, which they already have for CAPOs, clarifying interactions with the agency of ag. Not really significant, 10 pages maybe. The advocates want the entire program moved from the Agency of Agriculture to the Agency of Natural Resources. Bigger bill, bigger policy decisions, consequences, labor, staff, budget, etc. That's your decision. EPA says they want to see whatever the legislation is going to be by March 18th.
Like,
Yeah, I'm a game.
I have a question about that. So I don't want, I'm interrupting, when they say they wanna see the legislation. They would like something to be passed by then, or they just wanna see?
I don't know, that's a
Okay,
good
like
question.
his bill was filed.
Right, I mean. I. In their original letter that said that the agencies weren't meeting NIMTs, there was just such assumptions, like you will do this and. That's a legislative, that's a policy decision. You know, I think they have these assumptions that A&R can commit to things and not necessarily. So I think A&R can draft legislation and show it to EPA to support their more detailed corrective action plan. But the whole caveat is you are the supreme policy and lawmaking entity. You, Constitution says that you are that. And so you make those decisions ultimately. And that's why you're here.
But as far as what the EPA, it's not super clear what the EPA wants in terms of.
Well, they said they basically, and Secretary Moore, I was in Senate Ag yesterday, Secretary Moore said that they didn't approve it, which they didn't. But that they showed that, or indicated that A&R is moving in the right direction. Which I think that's their statement. But that A&R, that EPA needs more detail from A&R in order to prevent it.
So as much as we can move the legislative ball forward. That is helpful.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I just want to say it's not easy and it's not simple. And I originally did this for the ag committees, and I gave the ag committees a evolution of 40 years of ag water quality law. And then John Grogan the next day did kind of the evolution of all water quality law. And there's so many stories and so many things that's happened in the last 40 years that this is the next chapter. And you haven't even talked about basin planning, water classifications, aquatic nuisance, use of surface waters by like wake boats, etc. Line sewer overflows, PFAS in water, microplastics, etc. There you go.
So a lot there. Yes, go ahead.
What is this gonna translate to? Like farmers having to do once we slip through who's enforcing it, that's actually in place. What are we talking about?
So first thing would be inspection. The Agency of Natural Resources would have to lead an investigation team, be the primary investigator. They could probably bring somebody from ag with them. But they would have to investigate all large farms and likely all medium farms. And by that, I mean those that are medium concentrated, medium CAFOs or large CAFOs. A large CAFO is 700 cows or more. And I don't even want to go through the metal chart with you because it's like 40,000. A medium farm is 200 cows or more. I think there's only one farm that is not a livestock farm, that's a medium farm, and that's a horse farm. Although the secretary said yesterday that she thought that there was either a medium or a large egg farm, but I thought that farm had been shut down, but. So that's what you're talking about cow farm. Beef and dairy.
Going in, doing investigations, and then making recommendations, or well, more than that, about what has to happen, or to.
Well, what they will be inspecting for is discharge.
Yeah.
Or other triggers which presume discharge. And so, and then if they find that, they will require a NIPTES permit for that farm. And NIPTES permits don't allow a discharge except for the 25-year, 24-hour flood.
What is it, what does it take to get there to achieve that?
And that'll be farm dependent, farm specific. Some farms are probably don't have discharges because they've met the RAPs and the MFO and alpha urbanism. But will they be in a situation where EPA said, well, you're gonna be presumed to have a discharge because of your scenario? I can't say.
So as far as the policy, is that gonna be something like a committee bill that requires?
I think there may be, I've heard of some legislation sort of being drafted in the wings, so I think we could just look at the options we have and go from there. So that's how I'm thinking about it at the moment anyway, but happy to talk more.
So I mean, yesterday the Senate Ag asked the secretary if she's gonna have legislation, and Catherine Gessie is the general counsel for A&R said that they're working on it, and they'll get it to you. And that means they have to run out the flagpole to the.
Yeah, so this is gonna be something we have to talk about. Okay. Any other questions at this point? Okay, this is certainly not the last time that we'll be talking about these things, but it is good to get this background to sort of set the stage for us. So thank you so much for that. Oh my gosh, we are right on time. We are going to take a 15-minute break. We'll be back at 11.
That makes sense, most sense.
Okay, all right, so. This is still January 24th. We're coming back from a break. And yes, we are joined today again by Karina Daly from the NRC to talk about wetlands. So welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm excited that my PowerPoint is up and running.
Yes.
I feel the big win, and it's Friday.
And it's Friday, so good.
So good.
Thank you.
You're all right. Thank you.
Yeah, pleasure.
Well, good morning and thank you for having me back. Today I'm Karina Daly, restoration ecologist with Vermont Natural Resources Council. And I'm here today to talk about wetlands. Big overview. And I've worked as a consulting wetland scientist, both in the Intermountain West for about 7 years, and then in Vermont for 15 years. So we have a lot of wetlands, wetland experience in the consulting world. In the West, I worked for, in Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, Utah. And then when I moved east, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, primarily, and a little bit in New York. So that's my professional background in wetland science. And now working at the NRC, I work to reconnect rivers, remove dams, and a lot of those projects involve wetlands restoration. So I come at it with a different perspective as well. So wetlands are those unique areas where land and water intersect. And they're really sort of a semi-aquatic environment where the plants have their feet wet for an extended period of time. And really, they only need to be wet for 2 weeks out of the growing season to qualify as a jurisdictional wetland, so it doesn't have to be a long time, but they could be wet for the whole growing season. So it's that saturation of the soil for a period of time that causes a wetland, and then as a result, hydrophytic plants. What just happened? Stop sharing, maybe? Oh no, it's okay. I must have, maybe I hit something that's starting. Let me get back to it. Oh, believe it or not. There we go. I'll put it a little further away from me. So I was saying the vegetation, hydrophytic vegetation is vegetation that grows in a wetland due to that saturated soil. And there's a variety of plants that are considered hydrophytes that have different classifications of wetness. So a red maple is used to having its roots wet for a certain amount of time. Red maples can grow in very wet swamp areas, but they can also grow in uplands as well. So there's many different plants. I'm happy to get into that of the type. And then the soil, hydric soil, is soil that you really can identify pretty quickly in the ground by just digging a hole. And because of that water column being in the soil, the interstitial space of the soil is depleted, so it becomes anoxic and it loses its oxygen. And as a result, you can see remnants of where the water column has moved in the soil and stripped it of its oxygen, and that creates hydric soil. So to be a wetland, you need hydric soil, hydric vegetation, and hydrology. So you need that water connection. So whether that's groundwater, surface water, some type of saturation in that soil or sign of seasonal flooding in that area. Yeah, I need to move forward. There we go. So the Army Corps and the state of Vermont, the definitions are fairly similar. Army Corps' definition is wetlands are those areas that are wet for a period of time to adequately support wetland vegetation. So fairly simple. And I'll just note, I'm going to speak about the Army Corps later on, but the Army Corps of Engineers is a federal entity that regulates wetlands at the national level. So we have state wetland rules and we have federal wetland rules. And that's because wetlands are considered navigable waters or connected to navigable waters, hence why the Army Corps regulates them. So just indications that you're in a wetland: spongy ground, saturation at the surface, uneven ground, hummocks. You can go into a hummock forest, and that uneven ground is a result of just trees falling over time because their roots are shallow due to a shallow water table. An area you wouldn't want to drive your car. Those areas that are dominated by wetland vegetation, and a great way to look for wetlands is using aerial imagery. So looking from the air down, so you can use the ANR Natural Resource Atlas, the USGS Soil Survey, US Fish and Wildlife Service does a national wetlands inventory mapping. This slide just shows a wetland profile, and this is for a coastal wetland, but I think it applies pretty well to wetlands in New England overall. But you can see in this slide how the water level of the lake and of the groundwater impacts wetlands. So there's different, you could have a wetland that's fed by the levels of the lake or the river, whatever it is. You could have a wetland that's fed by the groundwater coming into that system on the slope. So not all wetlands are flat. Some of them are hillside slopes. Some of them are forested. Some of them are wet meadows, shrub swamps with emergent vegetation. So there's quite a diversity of wetlands, and some that are used to being wet for much longer periods of time and some for much shorter. I'm just going to take you through some of the common types of wetlands in Vermont. And the first, I think, is wet meadows, which are what we see a lot in our agricultural fields or our mowed lawns, areas that historically may have been forested wetlands, but have been managed over time in history to be sort of a mowed field, hay field, or lawn. One of these pictures is Technology Park in Williston, the wetlands behind there. And certainly these are areas that clay soils, so soils that are not very permeable, that hold that water. And also are good farmland soils. Forested wetlands, the other wetlands that I think people often don't recognize because they're used to imagining all wetlands to be cattail swamps. But there are a tremendous amount of forested wetlands in Vermont, and I think historically that's probably what was the majority of our wetlands were these large floodplain forests. And they're not always on floodplains. Floodplain forests are the easy ones because those are the flat areas adjacent to these large river systems. But we also have forested wetlands on hillside slopes at high elevations. So our forested wetlands can really range green ash, black ash, red maple, northern white cedar. Those are all species, forest tree species that are wetland hydrophytes. Floodplain wetlands, this picture, the larger picture on the left actually shows the water level. So you can see how this floodplain forest is used to flooding by about 3 feet. This is Lewis Creek, near the Shelburne salt shed in Shelburne. So quite a large floodplain forest. And these are silver maple species. And then we have our vernal pools, which are everyone's favorite, with big spotted salamander. If you've never seen a spotted salamander, you have to go out in the spring and help them cross the road, because these species move down into these vernal pools after the snow melts. And the vernal pools are these forested pockets that are fed by snow melt or rainwater, and they're only hold water for a short amount of time, so they're very temporal. And the salamanders lay their eggs in there and spend the whole like seasonal duration of the pool in that space as they mature, and then they migrate out as the pool dries out. So really critical habitat, often hard to identify, especially if the pools are dry and you're delineating in August when you wouldn't even see the pool, it just looks like some bare ground. But really critical for these species, not just the pool itself, but the upland around that pool. And then marsh wetlands along rivers, we have lots of marsh backwater wetlands, so braided river channels that create wetlands on the side. And then lastly, we've got our bogs and our bends. They use pictures of the Lady Slipper, our Esquo Bog, which is owned by the Nature Conservancy, which I got to do a flower walk there in June. So if you ever are in the Woodstock area in June, you definitely need to go to Esquo Bog. That's absolutely beautiful. But the showing lady slippers are on full display. And seeps. So bogs, bends are similar in that they don't have an inlet or outlet of water. So the water, it's called umbrotropic, and they have no inflow or outflow. So their water stays within, and they feed off the nutrients within that water. And then seeps, I showed you this slide actually earlier this week of this dam, headwater dam in Shrewsbury that we removed. But it's a really good way for people to visualize seeps, because when we remove that dam, we can clearly see all of this groundwater coming into this river system in the headwaters.
I'm just curious, last time, where is the dam? Where was the dam?
Yeah, the dam is along, well, do you see where the water's still impounding a bit?
Yeah.
Is right, the face of the dam is right in front of that, so you can see where the culvert is that was crossing. Yeah.
Good.
So it was covered with trees, so you can't see it very clearly, but it looks very different now because we've taken that out. So yeah, wetlands are nature's sponge, and they truly, when there are wetlands on floodplains, and not all floodplains are wetlands, but wetlands can be floodplains. They have the ability to retain stormwater. This is a picture taken by UVM Spatial Lab in Jeffersonville of a farm. And it's just showing that ability for the stormwater to be filtered through this wetland system. And recognizing that our climate is changing, and with these increased storm events, we need our natural infrastructure to provide the function that it's meant to do to slow down stormwater. I know some of you are familiar with what happened in Hurricane Irene with the towns of Middlebury and Rutland and flooding that happened there. But there's an extensive amount of wetlands that were restored upstream between Middlebury and Rutland, and because of that restoration along the Otter Creek, they believe that Middlebury was hit less by the storm event than Rutland itself. So that's, and they have economic analysis that shows just what those numbers were, but it was tremendous benefit restoring those wetlands. So more wetlands equal less flooding. And that's why the Clean Water Act, federal legislation, was enacted to protect and preserve the functions of the wetlands provide to society at large. So that's storage capacity, the capacity for filtration, for water quality, for wildlife habitat, and for stabilization, erosion control. And the act, I spoke to how the act prohibits the discharge of fill material into navigable waters. So that's where the Army Corps is regulating wetlands, because it's prohibiting that discharge into waters that we would navigate or be connected to navigable waters. And this diagram just is a simple graphic that illustrates how wetlands reduce peak stormwater flows over time, and how having healthy wetlands on the landscape reduces flooding. So in addition to the federal legislation that protects wetlands, Vermont has taken their own regulatory measures to protect wetlands. In 1986, the legislature adopted the Vermont wetlands rules. Those have been updated over time. But a wetland is recognized as significant based on the functions and values it provides to society at large. So there's 10 wetland functions and values that the state recognizes. And that's flood control, water quality, fish and wildlife habitat, natural communities and rare species, education and research, recreation and economics, and open space and erosion control. So those are the 10 functions. And to be so then in addition to the 10 functions, to be a significant wetland, you're either a class 1 or a class 2. So there's a wetland classification process that identifies the significance of the wetland. So class 1 wetlands are those wetlands that are considered rare and irreplaceable. And there's not a ton of them in the state. They're fairly rare and infrequent. And they have a 100-foot buffer, so it's protecting the wetland itself and the buffer around it. So recognizing that transitional area between the wetland and the upland as being important, because there is a long history of encroachment on our wetlands in Vermont. In fact, we have scientists have identified that since European colonization, we have lost over a third of our wetlands in the state. So there's a tremendous amount of historic loss that we are working to make up for. Class 2 wetlands are also significant at the state level, and those wetlands are basically any wetland that provides those 10 functions, some of those 10 functions and values, not all of them, and they require a 50-foot buffer. And then there's class 3 wetlands, which are wetlands that are not deemed to provide any function to Vermont society at large, and therefore they are not worthy of protection. And they're typically like very isolated, fragmented wetlands that have, really no capacity, maybe have been a little mowed puddle or rut type of wetland. It's very uncommon to actually find class 3 wetlands on the landscape, because typically when you are delineating wetlands and looking at wetlands, even if there is a history of impact, it has a connection to a larger system. So it ultimately is connected. If that connection is completely lost, then yes, for sure, it would be class 3.
Yes, question.
Yeah.
So, I actually had a constituent with a question about this last week. What happens if a wetland develops due to human activity?
Yes.
And then the human activity like ends, or the person wants to end what they're doing to introduce water. How does that get?
Yeah. So at the federal and state level, man-made wetlands are protected and they can be created. It's unusual to be able to create a wetland. It's really hard to do that without there having been some type of historic wetland there. So often people will say, it's a ditch, it's always been a ditch. It actually probably wasn't a ditch. At one point, it may have been a stream or a swale that then became a ditch because we wanted to drain that water
Yeah.
but so there are ditches created in uplands, ditches created in wetlands is probably the most like confusing and thing that we often get hung up on, which happened first and trying to think.
In my area, it's usually like somebody drills a well
Yeah,
and the well has discharge.
Yeah.
And the discharge ends up creating something, and then what happens if the well dries up, or if the person wants to cap that well or
something like that.
Yeah.
I think you're right. Yeah, I've come across that too, like the old concrete wells.
Yeah.
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 So what I can say is wetlands change over time, they're dynamic, so they have to be delineated every 5 years. So often, If a man-made wetland stops being managed as such, it can dry up and no longer be a wetland. So there is that recognition that, and if you buy a piece of property and have a delineation on it, you wanna make sure that delineation is good, because if it's expired, then it's not, there's potential that there's change there. It's not that wetlands are really changing that fast, but in cases like that, could be man-made wetlands.
Thank you.
One little question.
So with the class one wetlands, you said there aren't many, is that just that there not many have been designated? Because my guess is there's a lot that would be designated
Yes.
if the application was made, is that? accurate?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct,
So really,
Yeah.
people haven't been
Yeah.
making the effort to get them designated.
yes,
Yeah, okay.
no, thank you for that.
Yeah.
And then just lastly, under Act 250 jurisdiction and Act 248. Class 3 wetlands can be jurisdictional, so they're not always considered non-significant, so there is that little complication addition, but yes. It's important to understand that. And I think just some of the threats, I spoke to just the long history of wetland impact in Vermont. But it's also the lack of understanding of wetlands, so that's why I started with just trying to explain all the different types of wetlands that are out there, because I think we really struggle with understanding what a wetland is, because it's really doesn't have to be that long for a wetland to hold, an area to hold water for it to become a wetland. So it's really hard to protect a resource if we first can't even identify it on the landscape. So we have a history of not having great data on our wetlands in Vermont. Our maps weren't accurately showing where our wetlands were, and that was causing a tremendous amount of frustration. So I think that's the biggest threat. And then it's that physical disruption of their function, so the fragmentation of the freshwater connected system. And these slides just show floodplains that have wetlands, but the river in one case can no longer access that due to the armored bank and the development, the septic system that was put right next to the river. So reconnecting that system is really important, and keeping it from being fragmented into the future. And then the forested wetland with the spring green up in the picture is a wetland that was not mapped, and it was an area that was proposed for development. And if you came across it maybe during a dry portion, August or September, you likely wouldn't even recognize it as a wetland. So it's really important to be digging a little deeper underneath the soil and knowing your vegetation to identify these places. This slide is taken from Vermont Wetlands Program at DEC, that they're doing excellent work to update the data for wetlands in Vermont. And this is the mapping that's going on now. In 2019, they updated this pink area of the map. They're currently updating the Connecticut River watershed. I'm looking forward to seeing the results of that. But the plan is to have updated national wetlands inventory mapping for the whole state by 2025, which is really excellent. That being said, the mapping is a planning tool. It's regulatory in that it shows where class 1 and class 2 wetlands are on the landscape, at least those that have been delineated and submitted. But that doesn't mean those are the only class 1 and 2 wetlands on the landscape. So we can't say, oh, it's not on the map, it's not a wetland. Certainly there are wetlands out there that have not been delineated and need to be updated. So there's 3 different layers that we look at when we're using the maps: the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory layer, which is the class 1 and class 2 wetlands, the Wetlands Advisory layer, which shows potentially other wetlands that haven't been ground truthed and it's non-regulatory, and the hydric soils layer. So if you pull up the hydric soils, that shows where we have impervious soils on the landscape and is often a very good indicator of wetlands.
I should mention we're,
Yeah,
when we're out of time at some
Okay.
point here, I mean,
I see it like 5 minutes
yeah.
or not even.
Four bells are already.
Yeah, I was just saying, I don't know if the bells are going up now. Yeah.
Okay, I'll wrap it up.
You get 4 minutes.
Apologies.
It's okay.
So protection of wetlands is just identifying these things, improving the mapping. Vermont has created the Vermont Association of Wetland Science, which is an excellent organization working to do more education and outreach related to this work. And the Flood Safety Act, Act 121, has additional measures to further protections of wetlands, recognizing their importance for flood safety. And I'm happy to get into that, but maybe not now, and we'll do that later as we need to, based on timing. And the wetlands net gain is a part of the Flood Safety Act, and it's something that the state's been doing for a long time already. Their permitting program, but the goal of the net gain policy with the Flood Safety Act is really to put that into legislation and to make sure that we're restoring wetlands in the same watershed where they've been impacted.
18.5 acres is all, that's it? The gain, the net gain?
18.5 acres is all
From 2016 to 2020?
correct.
Damn.
Restoration, well, we're going in the right direction.
Yes. That doesn't include, right, so that doesn't include like conservation and restoration of wetlands, that's just permitted activities. Where they've been mitigated.
Oh,
So
Okay.
there's a difference, this is
Okay.
within the permitting program. And with that, I'll just leave you with the importance of these systems and how really we can avoid future storm events if we work to protect our nature-based solutions, including our wetlands.
Thank you, and I'm sorry that we're
The beeping.
ending a little early.
Well, you guys are busy.
Yeah, well, and I do, I think it is worth talking more about the flood safety act.
Question.
Yes, yeah, so to be continued.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, and with
Thank
that,
you for your time.
absolutely, and with that, we are adjourned.